welcome to Daily Debrief brought to you by People's Dispatch. I'm Pragya. We are going to talk about plebiscite for a new constitution in Chile, attack on Cristina Fernandez in Argentina, and US President Joe Biden talks about democracy. Argentina's Vice President Cristina Fernandez de Kirchner narrowly escaped an assassination attempt on Thursday. The incident occurred outside her home in Buenos Aires. Protesters are at her residence since last week, opposing judicial persecution of the former president. The assassination attempt has invited widespread condemnation and is being regarded as an attack on democracy. Television cameras captured a man emerge from the crowd, raise a handgun to her face, and attempt a shot which seemed to misfire while she was meeting her supporters. The gunman has been arrested. We'll talk to Prashant from People's Dispatch about what happened. Prashant, this assassination bid comes in a context. There's a judicial probe into her. What's really going on here?
Right, like you said, very shocking visuals. I mean, it's a very miraculous and narrow escape that she had. The gun jammed, otherwise she would definitely not have been able to survive this. And it's a very important, it's not an isolated event, like I said, because Cristina Fernandez de Kirchner is one of Argentina's most popular politicians. She is kind of a figure around whom a lot of radical sections could try to coalesce and try to push their agenda a bit more. And for that reason, she's always been a fierce enemy or opponent of the right. The right especially reviles her in Argentina. So we do know that over the past 10 days or so, a judicial process is on. There have been a number of corruption allegations against her. Sections across Latin America have termed this as lawfare. Lawfare, of course, as we know, the attempt to use law and legal provisions to basically clamp down on social movements, popular leaders, etc. We saw the same happening with Lula in Brazil, corruption case against him, which ultimately turned out to not have any merit at all. So Cristina Fernandez de Kirchner said that the same is happening with her in Argentina. She's decided to fight the legal battle. But what we've seen over the past 1 week to 10 days is there's been this outpouring of hatred against her. The right-wing media, sections of the right-wing politicians, right-wing media, opposition parties, etc., all of them sort of concentrating this virulent negative campaign against her. And in that sense, we have the assassin who may be a bit of a lone wolf. He's, of course, on the extreme fringe of the right, someone who proudly displays Nazi symbols, the black sun and the swastika on both his arms. So he's, of course, definitely to the fringe. But I think it would be also a bit of a mistake to see this as just something completely separated from what's been happening over the past few days in Argentina. So, like I said, a very strong demonization campaign going on. The prosecutor has called for 12 years in prison for her, called for her to be barred from politics entirely. Now, Cristina and her supporters have pointed out that a lot of this evidence is planted. They pointed out the close links between the judicial officers and the former president Mauricio Macri, the right-wing president Mauricio Macri. So all this together, it presents a very dark and difficult picture for the people of Argentina right now because, this was just one incident, of course, but the targeting of someone who is considered as a spokesperson for the more progressive causes is definitely something to be worried about at large for the people. And it also means this is a sign of greater chaos that might come to society as of now, because this campaign it may halt a bit right now, but it'll keep continuing because the right knows that if they're able to, say, stop the career of Cristina, if they're able to stop her activity and her work, it'll probably be it'll be a big blow for left and progressive causes in the country. So this is a larger context in which these this kind of incident has taken place. Like I said, on the one hand, we do recognize that the assassin may be more of a fringe figure, but it would be wrong, like I said, to see it separately from the kind of malicious campaigning that has been going around. Important to also note that her supporters have been consistently staging protests. There's been large-scale mobilization in support of her, some of which will also increase after this assassination attempt as well.
Prashant, how has the world generally seen this assassination bid? What have been the responses?
Right, so I think across the world, in fact, even in Argentina, amongst the right-wing opposition too, everyone has sort of condemned this and have raised a lot of concern about this. And I think, at least for progressive and left leaders across Latin America, a key element of this is the radicalization of the right wing that has been taking place in many of these countries. And this radicalization is something that is supported by the mainstream. Let's be very clear about this. We do not, this is a kind of complementary process where the various, the mainstream right, the main institutions of the country have been in some senses standing by or even complicit in a covert way, maybe promoting many of these radical right-wing fringes fringe elements that are there and giving them that space. And now we've seen a very similar process in Europe. We've seen a very similar process in the United States, also
Right.
taking place right now in Latin America. So I think a lot of the concern about the assassination attempt, one is of course the relief that she has, so she survived this attempt. Such an important leader survived, was now survived this attempt. But also, I think a concern about the kind of politics that is being given space inside Latin America. This extreme right-wing, neo-Nazi, supremacist kind of politics, which does not bode well for anybody at all, because it ends up being sort of, in addition to assassination attempts like these are the same kind of forces which have caused a lot of violence in many other parts of the world as well. So I think that is also something that is, this undercurrent for the kind of global support and especially the continental support she's receiving at this point of time.
Right, Prashant. Thanks very much, and we'll be back with you in just another minute. Chile heads for a historic plebiscite on Sunday. The country is to vote for or against a new draft constitution which promises state-sponsored education, healthcare, and respect for workers and indigenous peoples' rights. The existing constitution, drafted during Augusto Pinochet's dictatorship in 1980, offered little to workers and labor or human rights of citizens. Chile has seen several decades of state violence and active mobilizations demanding a new and very different constitution. A constitution convention has drafted the new document in a process that began last year in May. We'll go back to Prashant to talk about it a little more. Prashant, can you talk about the process of drafting this constitution and also the convention? Who are the forces behind it?
Right, Pragya. So if you see, this is truly a historic moment for Chile, irrespective of what happens on Sunday when the plebiscite is taking place. The fact is that there were massive protests that took place in Chile. And first of all, let's go back a bit to the history. Like you said, 1973, Salvador Allende overthrown by Augusto Pinochet. Augusto Pinochet, of course, closely associated with the Chicago Boys, economists who sort of pioneered what is called neoliberalism,
Right.
and which is destroying the entire world for decades now. But Chile was actually kind of the lab, the experiment space for a lot of these policies. And in fact, the constitution drafted at that time even had a provision for privatization of water resources. So the Chileans, even after the overthrow of Augusto Pinochet's government, they have been living in the shadow of this constitution, of this philosophy of rule, which basically, provides for a government, provides for legal structures, but provides for these structures not with the real view for the people, but for capital and big business. So the government's role is basically to be an enabler for business to actually carry on as usual, for the capitalists to make money, and not for the people at large. So this is that framework of the constitution which has been there in Chile, and I think there have been many waves of protest, by the way. It's important to note. The most famous one in 2019, but even before that, in 2006, in 2011, I believe there were multiple waves of protest which took place, often led by students, all of which sort of built to this moment. So it's very important to remember the historic process, which led to this moment where a new constitution has been drafted. And after these protests, of course, the important thing about the 19 protests was also that it was not just a call for a change in government or a change in the political party ruling them. It is a call for a change. It is a call for a new document, for a new philosophy of governance, right? And that is a context in which this Constitutional Assembly was formed. Very progressive Constitutional Assembly. A lot of people representing social movements were taking part, because actually the number of people from political parties was far less. A lot of people
Right.
from movements. There was a lot of space for indigenous activists. It was a gender even Constitutional Assembly, which again is quite remarkable. And the document that came out is actually quite radical, because it brings together several of these principles. One, the idea that the government has to provide a series of rights. So you talked about the social rights such as education, health, etc. It addresses the issue of climate change, for instance, in a very serious way. Again, from the perspective of rights, not just by saying in an anodyne way that we should face climate change. From the question of rights, it talks about the rights of indigenous people. It talks about the rights of women. It recognizes domestic work, for instance. So a lot of aspects which are not only important in the present but also important for the future are enshrined in this constitution, and that is what really makes this a unique document. It also talks about the possibility of people participating in the lawmaking process. Again, which again destroys the artificial separation between the
Right.
people who are just the subjects and those politicians who are supposed to draft laws in parliament, right? So it takes away that separation and gives people a greater say in even drafting of laws. It talks about independent agencies which can provide oversight to prevent corruption and other kinds of issues. So all in all, a very a constitution which was written keeping in mind the aspirations of the vast majority of people, keeping in mind the aspirations of the marginalized sections of the people who need government support of the government the most, and also keeping in mind that those people should have a say in governance.
Right, Prashant. Prashant, can you also talk about the different pushes and pulls on this constitution? What is the likelihood that we can predict the verdict?
Right. So of course, like Pragya, like on this show, we refuse to predict, verdicts just to be completely safe ourselves. But it's a difficult election. Let's be clear about that, because we do know that a constitution of this nature has set off the right wing in Chile massively. Chile has, of course, a very strong entrenched capitalist section, which has benefited from decades of the old constitution's policies, right?
Right.
So they are not going to sit back and let this pass easily, because this constitution like this gives the government a free hand to enact a lot of policies which will be dangerous for them. So these institutions, for instance, which have control over the media, which have control over other state, these sections, sorry, which have control over the media, which have control over other sections of the state, they have been running a very powerful campaign against this constitution, calling it too radical, calling it too left-wing, calling it, anti-business, calling it, I think the economists called it a woke constitution.
Woke.
So woke, yes, so that
Okay.
really explains it, in the sense
Right.
that they're doing everything possible to discredit a constitution which guarantees people their rights. And that's enough. That says enough about these right-wing sections. But unfortunately, the fact is that such campaigns also have effect, because it's a campaign of fear. It's a campaign of creating tension, causing distrust, telling people that, hey, all this constitution is going to throw life out of gear. This constitution is going to destroy the country's economic framework. This constitution will lead to capital going out, etc., etc. So all these kind of rumor mongering and scaremongering has been going on in full swing, as was expected. On the other hand, those supporting the constitution have rallied in large numbers. I think on the last day of the campaign, there was a huge rally that took place in support of this constitution. So there is a good sense of enthusiasm among its supporters. We see social movements, we see writers, artists, intellectuals, indigenous leaders, women leaders, all of them sort of supporting the constitution, trying to come out in all their strength to vote. Now, voting is mandatory, of course, in Chile, so the results are still very touch and, they're very uncertain, they're very up in the air right now. Remains to be seen what will happen. But if it does get adopted, and also, like I said, irrespective of the result, the process so far itself has been a great victory. And I think it's a great sign for people across the world, because it tells you that constitutions are vibrant and living documents. They're not just, they're not originalist documents which are sacrosanct, drafted once and never to be changed again. Two, that constitutions have to adapt and move on also. They need to understand the requirements of the time. They need to take into consideration the needs of the most marginalized. And point number three, constitutions also need to provide people, the ordinary people of the country, the ability to participate in the legal and process of governance beyond just voting.
Right.
And that's a very important distinction that constitutions like Chile's proposed constitution make.
Right, Prashant. Thanks a lot for that. US President Joe Biden has delivered a speech on democracy at threat in the United States. He called MAGA, or the Make America Great Again Republicans, who follow former President Donald Trump, as extremists. According to Biden, not all Republicans are extremists, but most are. Biden has been fighting off Trump's campaign, claiming Republicans won the 2021 presidential election. Despite a congressional probe into the 6 January Capitol Hill incident and a raid on Trump's property last month, that campaign is not showing signs of slowing. And the US heads for midterm elections in November. It will likely be Biden administration's toughest test. Anish from People's Dispatch has more detail. We spoke to him earlier. Great. Anish, great to have you here. Anish, can you start by sort of talking about whether this sounds like a midterm election speech? Does it sound like a blueprint for what Biden is going to offer?
I mean, it is very clearly an attempt to gear the Democratic Party towards, or at least give a campaign statement to the Democratic Party for the midterms. And there are definitely reasons for that, considering the fact that recently he has seen very bad approval ratings. In some polls, it was almost negative approval ratings as well. So this is not the best time for the Biden administration. Recently, what we talked about very recently about the student debt forgiveness that happened, as limited as it is, it actually gave some impetus to the Democrats in general, and it also showed that the Biden administration can actually do a lot more with a better Congress, or a more supportive Congress in his state. So in this respect, definitely the speech comes across as an attempt to push the election uh, machinery of the Democrats forward, which has been pretty much stuck with infighting and issues with several groups fighting over the kind of candidates that they want to put for the kind of the promises that they actually want to push for, even the kind of bills and legislations that they want to push for in the Congress. So these factors definitely overshadowed much of the what could have been good campaign time for the Democrats, and that they need to really make up for that. So this was an attempt to that. But then we have to also look at the record that the Democrats have had in the past more than 1.5 years in power. They may not have an outright majority in the Senate, but they have a majority in the House. They have the presidency, but the number of promises that they actually delivered in is very, very little. Even the promises that they did deliver eventually had watered down to the point where it actually excluded a larger number of people than it intended to include. And this includes the student debt waiver. This also includes the very piecemeal attempt at passing the voting rights legislation that could have protected a whole lot of working class Americans, especially Black Americans, from being disenfranchised over various technicalities that the Republicans are pushing for. Again, essential factors that are required to protect democracy. So the record in general is not very heartening for most Americans to go for, but there is an impetus they have right now, and they're trying to work hard on that.
Anish, does it sound also a bit odd or ironic, at least, that the speech repeatedly refers to extremism, to democracy, etc.? Is it even possible to use the word hypocrisy over here?
Uh, uh, Hypocrisy, maybe not, but then there is definitely the fact that they did not want to address the reality of right-wing extremism, growing right-wing extremism in the United States in such a manner. And this is definitely a first of its kind, where a sitting president, is talking about the dangers of right-wing extremism and the kind of politics that they are pushing for. So definitely, but what did they do about it over the past since 2021 is something that we all know. The obviously the administration is trying to come down on Trump for his past actions, but there is very little being done to address real problems that on the ground, real problems that affect working class Americans, including union rights, including voting rights, abortion rights, obviously. So these are factors that the Democrats have delivered very little in. And the fact that they have been incapable of actually delivering on these fronts, and not entirely because it was the Republicans who were trying to filibuster it in the Senate, but also because they themselves were not united on many of these fronts, shows that there is a problem that the Democrats really need to address within their house rather before they actually go into the midterm elections. But that is also not being done. So obviously there needs to be a lot more work that needs to be done by the Democrats to ensure that they have a fighting chance in the upcoming midterms. But we do not really see that happening apart from these campaign slogans. Even the student debt waivers came so painstakingly, in a painstakingly glacial manner, and even the manner in which that it was delivered was so watered down that it was even more supposedly moderate, as they would like to say, than what Biden had promised himself in his election campaign. So definitely a lot more work needs to be done for the Democrats to actually have a fighting chance. We need to wait and watch how it is going to work out. We also need to wait and watch how they are going to protect democracy in the coming months, considering that the Republicans are, as they say, run by the MAGA Republicans. So again, it's a wait and watch show right now for all of us.
Right, Anish. Thanks a lot for joining us. And that is all we have for you today. Thank you for watching Daily Debrief. Do come back to us tomorrow. Follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And for more updates like this, please visit our website, peoplesdispatch.org.